I want to talk about the question that many Christian apologists dread. And perhaps they have a right to, because for many of them, this question does exploit a key vulnerability in their position, in their ethics or meta ethics. But I want to offer my own response to it. The question is a hypothetical. If God commanded you to kill your child, would you do that? Or some variation of that question. Now, practically speaking, I think it's fair to say that question is prompted in particular by the Akedah, the story in Genesis 22 of the offering of Isaac, verse 2. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." And there are contemporary examples and examples throughout history of people who, for many different reasons, have believed God did, in fact, command them to engage in actions like this. One of them in 2004 in Plano, Texas, a mother named Dina Schlosser killed her infant, believing that this was within God's will for her to do so. So we not only have a biblical precedent in this story of the Akedah in Genesis 22, but also people throughout history who have done that. And so the questioner asks, the skeptic asks the Christian apologist or the theist apologist, would you sacrifice your child if God commanded you to? In the background is a sense of the threat of moral chaos that could come if one, in fact, then becomes a theist and, in principle, could be commanded to do pretty much anything. My response is to simply say God would never command me to kill, sacrifice a child, because I don't believe God would ever command an evil action, and I believe that is an inherently evil action. Now, when I make that statement, that response, I'm appealing to moral knowledge, the moral knowledge of moral necessity, that this is the kind of act that it could never be morally justified or right or morally obligatory to do. This depends upon an understanding that human beings, when they are functioning properly, including functioning properly in their moral perception, that they grasp moral intuitions as properly basic, that categorize particular types of actions as either intrinsically good and thus possible to do, or intrinsically evil and thus impossible to do from a moral perspective. And among the actions that are possible to do is various actions by which one loves one's neighbor and shows compassion. Actions that are impossible to do would include actions like rape or torture, certainly torture for fun, or sacrificing one's children. I believe that one would know those things are wrong intuitively, in a properly basic way, simply by reflecting on the action itself and forming a moral belief based upon that reflection, which is simply, I believe, our moral perceptual faculties understanding when they're functioning properly that this is an intrinsically wrong thing to do. And I talk about that at some length in my book, Jesus Loves Canaanites. Now, you might ask, okay, but what about Genesis 22? What do you do with that? And for that, that becomes a question of biblical interpretation, first of all, rather than moral epistemology, first of all. And for that, I would recommend people take a look at Richard Middleton's book, Abraham's Silence, where he offers, for me, a very compelling understanding of how to interpret Genesis 22, not in a way that lauds Abraham for his faithfulness, but rather a way that actually critiques Abraham for not pushing back on the command that he believed had been given to him. So this is a very different interpretation of the story of the offering of Isaac, and one that closely aligns with our moral intuitions on the inherent wrongness of sacrificing children. So read Abraham's Silence if you want to learn more about how you could interpret and think about and apply Genesis 22 in a way that is consistent with your moral perception rather than in contradiction to it. So to conclude again, I don't think God would ever command this. Now, here's where the skeptic is going to come back and say, oh, fair enough. You don't think God could or would. But what if God did command it? What then? Well, so then my first response is to say, if I started experiencing phenomenology where I believed God was communicating directly to me and commanding me to do something that I believed to be intrinsically morally wrong, I would check myself into a mental hospital because on the balance of probabilities, I'd have very good evidence that I was in fact delusional, was perhaps schizophrenic, and thus I should get proper treatment. The atheist or skeptic may then try again and says, okay, but let's assume that you're not delusional. Let's assume that in fact God really is commanding you to kill your child. Would you do so? First thing we have to keep in mind then at this point is let's be clear on what we mean by God. When we say God, we mean a omniscient and omnipotent being who is perfectly morally good, or is the embodiment of goodness. Now, it could either be that that being is him, her, it, or they self, their self, the perfect exemplification of good, or somehow they are the form of the good, or they model good perfectly. But whatever it is, they will never do or command anything that is immoral or contrary to that which is morally good or obligatory. So now what the skeptic is asking is, if a morally perfect being commanded you to do that action, would you in fact do it? It's at this point that I'm going to respond with what we call a tu quoque. Now, Alvin Plantinga used to call the tu quoque the same to you, buddy response. And I think that's a fair colloquial summary of this type of response. This type of response is going to say, whatever response I'm going to give is the same response you as a skeptic would be required to give in a similar situation. Because whether it's the Christian or the atheist, if a morally perfect being who is omniscient, who can make no mistakes, who is the perfect embodiment of the good, commands you to do something, then by definition, that would be the right thing to do. The entire scenario itself is what we call a per impossibile scenario, which means that it is being proposed contrary to what we believe to be actually possible. It's kind of like asking, uh, if per impossibile you could go back in time to before your existence, would you prevent yourself from being born? It's this hypothetical that is not possible. And so that's the kind of thing we're now talking about here. And the same thing again is whether it's a theist or a skeptic or anything else, if you are saying that a morally perfect, omnipotent, omniscient being has commanded that, well, then by definition, it is something you ought to do because it is the embodiment of the good. But we don't believe that is possible. Now, another way to see how this is a tu quoque is to point out that that same reasoning can apply to any other moral framework as well. So let's say that your skeptic is, in fact, a utilitarian, but they're a rule utilitarian, meaning that they believe the good is defined by any action which secures the greatest good for the greatest number, but that in principle, some actions by the rules, some actions are excluded from ever possibly being the greatest, that which could provide the greatest good for the greatest number. And their rule, one of their rules excludes sacrificing children. So on this account, this utilitarian's position is it could never be right to sacrifice a child to secure the greatest good for the greatest number. That is impossible. And then you now, as the theist, turning the tables on the skeptic, says this, yeah, but what if, per impossibile, it was the case that sacrificing the infant would secure the greatest good for the greatest number? In that case, would you in fact do so? And at this point, that skeptic utilitarian is in the exact same position as the theist, responding, forced to respond to a per impossibile scenario, and with the same response. Yeah, by definition, if that is in fact the greatest good for the greatest number, then it would be obligatory to do it. If in fact the morally perfect being did command that, then it would be obligatory to do it. But in each case, it doesn't follow that we believe such a scenario is possible. And thus, in this response, you can neutralize this most feared of all questions from skeptics. I've linked Jesus Loves Canaanites and also Abraham's Silence below if you want to read more either about moral epistemology or how to interpret Genesis 22.